Hello and welcome to the Try Mechanics podcast. This podcast is all about fruit, and it's hopefully going to try and serve the question, is fruit actually healthy? So the short answer is, well, it all depends on the dose. The long answer is something I'm going to go into now. And in order to think about this question in a slightly different way, I'm going to reframe things. I'm going to ask you, do you think that a chocolate brownie is healthy? Now, your instant answer to that might be no. I mean, that would be the kind of indoctrinated answer from most areas of society, that a chocolate brownie is a great treat, but it's not a healthy thing. However, if you ask certain people, is fruit healthy? They'll say, yes, of course it is. It contains all of those minerals and nutrients that we need, and essentially we can't eat too much of it. The problem is that we've had this recommendation of 5 a day, which is fruit and vegetables. And I would bet that the majority of people, if they are getting their 5 a day, are getting them from fruit. And the other thing about fruit, the other question I'm actually going to try and answer, is that all fruit is not created equal. It's a very broad label because all fruits are very, very different from each other. They contain different things that we may or may not need, and they contain things that maybe we don't need. So back to my question again, if I was to ask you about whether a chocolate brownie was good for you, you'd answer with no. Of course it's not. It's high in fat, it's high in sugar, it's high in lots of things essentially, lots of calories that you don't really need. It's very sweet, tends to make you want to eat more of it. But is it good or bad for you? Well, the key thing is actually a chocolate brownie is made of many things. Of some of those things in there, some of them are good for you. So if we break it down, and we take away, let's say we made that brownie without sugar, and we're left with eggs, possibly some butter, maybe grass-fed butter that's got lots of vitamins and minerals in it. Eggs are a fantastic food, possibly one of nature's only superfoods. I think essentially eggs and avocados, to my mind, are pretty much nature's superfoods with a bit of maybe oily fish thrown in for good measure. You could make that brownie with avocados, actually. You can mash up avocados and put them in to make it very decadent. You could put some ground nuts in there as well, which might give you a bit of a source of various minerals, including magnesium and various other kind of trace minerals. So essentially, we're going on the basis of that it's very high in fat and sugar, and then maybe now with the current trend of saying that sugar's bad, that we could take the sugar out and it'd be okay. Maybe we take the flour out, you can make flourless brownies and it might be okay. So you start to see that actually a chocolate brownie is not just a chocolate brownie, but also it does have some things in it. It has, and even if you went and bought a chocolate brownie that had been made the kind of traditional way, so with flour, eggs, butter and sugar, they're still getting the eggs, you're still getting the nutrients from that are possibly within that butter, if there are any, if it was cooked with the right butter. So that's the critical thing. But we all know that if you ate a big load of those brownies, the amount of sugar that was in it would cause you problems, or is likely to cause you problems, possibly for your own system, possibly for your gut bacteria. And that's what it all comes down to. It's all about the dose. The rules of toxicology state essentially that it's all about dose. Anything is not inherently toxic unless, and essentially it is in a dose that is high enough to cause toxicity. And that's what we've got to remember. Things like, let's say a good example of the kind of, your petrol station. How many of us have filled up on our petrol station for a journey, and then we've been going along, we've been offered a sweet or something by the people with us, and we've eaten it, and only to realise that essentially we've now covered that sweet in the petrol that we got on our hands when we filled up the car, and we just tasted a load of petrol in our mouth. And not only is it very unpleasant, but at that point we don't suddenly keel over and die. That's because even though petrol would be toxic in a relatively low amount, the amount that was on our fingers was low enough that it didn't cause us actually any harm. The same as things like cyanide is a good example, a well-known poison. However, it occurs naturally in almonds. We just don't eat that much of it. And often we delineate something as being toxic when the dose is found in kind of normal life, in that we wouldn't have to go far beyond what we would normally take in or what would be available to be able to do us some serious harm. But where we draw this line is very difficult, because anything can be toxic in the right dose. Anything that supposedly would be good for us can probably turn toxic if we had enough of it. So that's when we come back round to fruit. Now, what is the problem with fruit? Surely it's all good and no bad. Fruit has fibre in it. Fruit has those minerals and various nutrients in it that are quite beneficial to our body, and it does. There's lots of different fruits that have lots of different things in. So you have just the classics of banana, has a good amount of potassium and a few other minerals in the flesh, and actually has magnesium in the peel that can be used to make a certain kind of tea where you actually get a good amount of magnesium out of that peel. Oranges and various other citrus fruits tend to have a lot of vitamin C, as well as a few other vitamins and minerals in them. And then we look at, obviously, the berries, and they have a lot of phytonutrients and those things. So surely, with all this in mind, then eating a good amount of fruit has got to be good for you. The problem is, it tends to be packaged with fructose. Now, we've bounced around over the last few years about what's causing most of the problems. And we're coming to the conclusion that fructose, and particularly high doses, again, coming back to the dose, is a real problem. Because we only have a small capacity to digest fructose ourselves. We only have a certain amount of fructose transporters available to us. And this is why it frustrates me how the majority of sports nutrition now has moved towards having fructose in, with this idea that if you can't get enough glucose in, then maybe if we shove some fructose in, we'll be okay. The problem is that we used to take this in the form of sucrose, table sugar, which is a molecule of glucose and fructose, and is bound. And the critical thing about that is that it then goes to the border of the intestine, what's called the brush border. The molecule is cleaved, so it becomes glucose and fructose, and they are then absorbed. The critical thing is that if you take in fructose alone, unbound, which is what's in a lot of sports nutrition because they've combined maltodextrin with fructose, actually that fructose can cause quite a few problems. Because if it doesn't go directly to that border and doesn't get absorbed straight away, there's something else there that loves that fructose, and that's the bacteria. A lot of us now have actually got more bacteria in our stomachs, in our first part of our intestine, than we really should have. It's an idea, something called the labelled SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is essentially the small amounts of bacteria that should be there have overgrown, whether they are good or bad. Sometimes we have more of those bacteria in our actual stomach, like bacteria like H. pylori that like it in the acidic environment, and they like fructose too. So, but they might not have the ability to digest or cleave a lot of those sucrose molecules. So actually, we sometimes might be better off. And this is why a lot of people have found the product of Tailwind. I find this quite funny, really, because Tailwind is essentially just dextrose. So it's just glucose. And a lot of people find it more tolerable than modern sports nutrition. Essentially, it's just dextrose powder. But actually, a lot of people find traditional drinks, things like traditional properly made Coke that's not with high fructose corn syrup, much better for exercise because it's often made with sucrose, so just table sugar. So actually that provides half and half. And even though we could do with an extra little kick of glucose, we don't want that much. We don't want a 1-to-1 ratio, of course. But actually, it's because of the way that it works, essentially is transported to the place it then is broken apart and then absorbed, and actually seems to, I think, be more beneficial. Now, we can increase the fructose intake or into the blood by taking free fructose in. We've shown that in studies. But we're always at a risk of overflow. And that's what it all comes down to. There was a recent paper that showed that when you gave a glass of orange juice to participants, when they went just beyond, so they could drink half a glass of orange juice, half a glass of fructose, or that amount of fructose, so it was about 10-15 grams, which is about, if you think about 10-15 grams, that's what you probably take in per hour in sports nutrition now these days. They took in that amount, but beyond that, when it overflowed to the bacteria further on down the gut, which started creating lots of problems. But they then actually put they turn that fructose back into glucose to go back into the system. And this was seen this is a worry for people like diabetic patients that are prescribed to have lots of fruit because it's slowly absorbing. Well, actually, it could end up causing a delayed response in their glucose. So even though their initial glucose spike, that GI index is quite low, as we've tested, they then get a delayed response. But also, what happens to all that fructose? It gets transported to the liver. Now, fructose that gets transported to the liver when the liver's glycogen store is essentially open and has space is fine. It restocks glycogen, so it has its place later on in events, I believe. So you can use it later on in events to help restock liver glycogen. So that's why I think the fructose that you get through sucrose in Coke Flat coat towards the end of an Ironman is so brilliant because it restocks that liver glycogen, stopping a lot of those signals that make you feel like you're starting to bonk, which is a lot of those signals are coming from the liver through to the brain to tell you that liver glycogen is running low and that you need to slow down. But the critical thing is that 3 or 4 or 5 pieces of fruit a day are really not very healthy, and particularly the types of fruits. So that's the other thing about fruit, is that particularly as British people, we would only have had access to fruit at certain times of year. And there is good amounts of evidence that it was designed for a purpose. There's a reason why certain animals that hibernate, that put on lots of weight in the autumn, ready to hibernate, eat lots of fruit. Because actually what it does is it goes to the liver and causes basically the liver to produce fat. So basically it causes lipogenesis, which is basically the formation of fat from that sugar in the liver, which it then sends to its fat tissue. And fructose is well known for being pretty much the best at that. So when these animals eat lots of fruit, they naturally take in lots of fructose, they get a bit fat, and that enables them to sustain a hibernation. And we do the same thing, but then we don't really need to hibernate, and we don't necessarily need the extra winter coat that it provides because we have central heating now. So if we eat fruit all year round, it can cause a bit of a problem. The other thing is the types of fruit. But having bananas from the other side of the world, having the oranges from Spain, all these things has created more of a problem because these fruits are extremely high and they've been bred to be very high in fruit. If you ate a piece of fruit, an apple, let's say, from 50, 60, maybe 100 years ago, it would be very tart. Apples have a lot of pectin in, they have a lot of things in, a lot of fibre, and almost no fructose. So your British apple was, very low in fructose, very low in fruit sugar. Well, that wasn't very nice. We liked fruit as our sweet treat, really. So we tried to overbreed it. And you end up with varieties like Empire that are very hyper sweet. The sweeter they are, the more they've been bred, and we've then bred them together, possibly with a bit of GMO thrown in there to make them extra sweet. And that's the critical thing, is that, again, all fruit is not created equal. Berries are a good example. Your farmed blueberry tastes a lot sweeter than a blackberry or a blueberry that you find out in the fields, a very different variety that tastes much more tart. We used to pick those blackberries, and unless they were super ripe, they were very tart, and we used to use them for making crumbles and things to essentially caramelise that starch that was in there that wasn't actually very sweet. So it's a very different thing. And that's the thing to bear in mind, is that when I say about whether fruit is good or bad, it is very much dose dependent, but also the types of fruit matter. Berries are a really, really good thing. The other thing about fruit compared to vegetables is it doesn't actually have much nutrient in it compared to good vegetables. Things like vitamin C and various other nutrients are much higher in your green leafy vegetables, more available as well. They don't come shuttled with that high sugar load at the same time. So having a more varied vegetable diet is more important. If you look at things like the Mediterranean diet, yes, they'll have their fruit, but they'll much more err on the side of vegetables and good quality fish and various other products, as opposed to believing that eating a few pieces of fruit a day will confer a lot of advantage. And actually, if you look at those countries, most of their fruit consumption, if you look at people like in France, as a good example, the French don't really eat much fruit at all. The fruit that they do eat, they ferment. So things like fermenting grapes to wine. Now what this does is it takes a lot of those sugars and turns them into something different. So obviously it turns them into alcohol and various other things. But actually, it uses bacteria to do the work to get rid of a lot of that fructose before you even take it in. Because that's the critical thing, is that if you also have a bit of an upset stomach, one of the worst things you can eat is fruit. Because the fibrous nature of fruit will take that fructose down to the bacteria that really have a great party and can cause a lot of bloating. The other thing about fibre in fruit is that there's some fruits like pectin high fruits like apples that have got good fibre in, and bananas have got good fibre and various other things, is that when they're greener, but we don't often eat them like that. So the critical thing is that actually we're not really getting as much of that fibre as we could do from those fruits, but we also are going towards the kind of sweeter types. The other problem with fruit, and it comes back to berries, is things like pesticides. If you want to try and avoid pesticides, which is a very good idea, then it's very difficult if you eat a lot of fruit, because organic fruit is not only really expensive, it spoils very quickly. It's hard to get from the field to the plate quickly enough really to stop it going mouldy because of the transport systems. So if you're going to eat fruit, I would urge you to go and find some local suppliers of organic berries. Because, as I say, the thing is that it's much better to have a very small amount of organic berries than it is to have normal berries that are probably one of the most pesticide-riddled foods that we have. The critical thing about pesticides is it's all about the vegetable. So things like your carrots and your root vegetable tend to be very low in pesticide residues, whereas your berries and your strawberries particularly are extremely high. And we know that even small amounts, going back to that rule of toxicology, that even small amounts of certain pesticides can cause disruption and problems, particularly with things like testosterone and male fertility. So it's definitely something to try and avoid. When it comes to organic, you've got to kind of pick your battles, really. It is best to eat organic green leafy veg because they tend to get sprayed a bit more. It's also best to avoid a lot of produce that comes from Europe, because actually countries like Spain do use a lot of pesticides. Now, as long as the residues are within a certain limit, they're okay, but actually those limits are relatively high, which is not really very good for us. So when it comes to fruit, the idea is to think of it really the same as the chocolate brownie, is that there are some good things in there, but it's all about that dose. It is about having small amounts of the high quality stuff, so small amounts of things like berries that provide that. Small, half a small orange or something like a satsuma or something is better, even though, again, it's been bred to be hyper sweet. It's probably better than having a whole orange. Again, it all comes down to that dose, and the definite thing to avoid is fruit juices, simply because with all that fibre taken away, you can drink a huge amount more of that fructose. So that's what I want to think about, is that actually it's not that fruit is necessarily good or bad, the same way that a brownie is not necessarily good or bad, but it all comes down to the dose and the amount that you eat, and also how it's been made. Sometimes when it comes to things like brownies, it's better off to have a small amount of a proper brownie than it is to try and crowbar them into something healthy, because at the end of the day, they are supposed to be a little sweet treat. And I often see the big problem with people like going on the paleo side of things is that they make a brownie, a big load of brownie out of a huge shed load of ground almonds, a huge tin of honey and all these things, and then label it paleo and label it good for you and eat the whole tray because it tastes really good. Whereas that honey causes the same disruption. The thing about honey is that it's got some good things in it, but again, it's meant to be consumed in very tiny doses. And if it was ever consumed in a massive dose like our kind of hunter-gatherer ancestors came across a beehive, they would feel pretty dreadful afterwards. But it would almost kind of serve a purpose. It would help them possibly pile on some fat in order to be able to survive colder conditions and those things. So you've got to think that our times have changed. So the kind of end notes really are that don't fear fruit, definitely not. Try not to have fruit juices. If you do have them in small doses. A good example of this is my wife has a little bit of orange juice, but we have a very small pot of orange juice that is normal orange juice, but she's been using for about a week now. So it's been used in small amounts in drinks for about a week, rather than if you have one of these innocent smoothies or something and you drink it all in one go, the amount of fructose that supplies to your bacteria is really not very good. Because the thing about the bacteria in our gut is that the ones that we've identified as probably being not as good, i.e. things like the E. coli, Klebsiella and Clostridia type species, they love fructose. They don't like things like inulin quite as much. They don't like things like onions and garlic and fibrous vegetables and those things as much as the bifidum do and the acidophilus species do. Whereas the acidophilus and the bifidum don't really like fructose that much. So they tend to give it to the bad bacteria. And if you eat a lot of those, it tends to cause a bit of that overgrowth and that disruption, which means you then start to not tolerate things like bread and gluten, which are handled or helped along in terms of their production by bifidum species. So, and actually then the other thing is that there's recent studies. So it's been fascinating listening to a book all about brain health and about how essentially food can impact on brain health both long-term and short-term. And actually it showed that older adults that had more fruit consumption, particularly around fruits like grapes and high sugar fruits, had significantly lower cognitive scores. So actually their cognitive decline accelerated by fruit. They also showed higher levels of depression. And we know this is related to things like tryptophan. So tryptophan is an essential amino acid, and we know that fructose that has been overflowed, essentially spilled over into lower down into the gut, inhibits the absorption of tryptophan. So actually, again, if you drink all that fruit juice, you're not going to absorb your tryptophan very well further down the line. And that can lead to lower levels of serotonin, and actually that can lead to lower mood. So whilst certain amounts of very good fruit, shall we say, the berries and things like that, have been linked to increased health, actually, there is as many studies to show that higher levels of eating very sweet fruits, particularly ones with pesticides and various other things, have now been shown to be poorer for our health. And normally what's shown for kind of lower cognitive health and brain health tends to extend to the rest of the body. So what I say is that when it comes to fruit, appreciate it for what it is. It is not something that is ridiculously healthy. You shouldn't be gorging on it. Have it as a small sweet treat and have it in a good dose. So have one small banana and that's it, not one small banana, orange, apple and these things. And probably limit yourself to 1 or 2 of those pieces of those high sugar fruits per day. But maybe a small handful of organic berries, or even better, when it's September, go out and find what you can find out in the fields. So some blackberries and various other berries out there, obviously not really nasty red ones, and make sure you're really careful with what you're actually picking, make sure they are actually blackberries, and then freeze them. And that's a much better way of doing it than going to your supermarket, paying a ridiculous amount for the kind of massive blackberries that are farmed in Spain and covered in pesticides. So that's the way I want you to think about fruit, is that the same way I think about chocolate brownie is that there's no such thing really as a good or bad food, much like there isn't a good or bad or anything toxic or non-toxic in our environment. It's all about the dose of it and the amount of it that you have. Thank you very much for listening, and if you've got any questions like this, please fire them across. Goodbye.